Jihan has a BA in political science and a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. He is particularly interested in applying insights from behavioral economics and game theory to improve policy. He laments the extreme partisanship currently afflicting this country and hopes that the flip side can help create common understanding in order to bridge political divisions. Please welcome Jihan.
Well, thank you for having me. Oh, it works. Awesome. So I'm here to talk about polarization, the media, and you. So without further ado, I will get started. So as I'm sure you're aware, we're pretty polarized recently. Oh, that is killing the very top. Well, it's okay. So here we have a map, and this map is county-level election results from the presidential elections from 2004 and 2016. You'll notice there's a lot of red on these maps and not quite as much blue, but that's because, so red is being Republican, blue is Democrat. Republicans tend to be more popular in sort of rural areas, and a lot of the blue areas have a lot more people. And if you'll notice, there's different gradations of red and blue. Deeper red and deeper blue means a more lopsided margin. And this is the county level. But I wanted to point out the differences between these two maps because they're a bit different. So up here, you see there's a lot of light blue, maybe in the sort of northern south and the Midwest, up in the Northeast. And this is 2004. That was an election the Republicans won. It was George W. Bush. But if you fast forward a bit to 2016, so 2016, the Democrats won the popular vote. Yet down here, there's no more light blue. There's no more light blue here. There's no more light blue here. It's all red. There's more blue here. So what you've seen in the 12 years or so is that we've actually seen a change where you're seeing a lot fewer districts where they're divided more or less evenly. You're seeing a lot more lopsided, very strongly for one candidate or the other. And I'm sure you're aware of this. I mean, we're obviously very polarized, and what's happening is people are almost sorting. So people live with other people who think like them and vote like them, and they don't really get exposed to people on the other side. And that's driving partisanship. So here's Illinois. It's cutting off the top, but Chicago is all the way up here. It's very, very deep blue, and that's actually most of the people in the state. So this is 2016, and Chicago in 2016 went pretty overwhelmingly for Democrats, but there's obviously a lot of red here. And this is all downstate. Now, there's a lot more people in Chicago, and Chicago won, but keep in mind that there are 2 million people who voted for Republicans just in the state of Illinois. So they're not only in the deep south, in Mississippi and Texas. There's actually a lot of Republicans pretty nearby, believe it or not. You may not encounter them, but they exist. So here we have some data from Pew, and basically they looked at the political beliefs of people in each party. And what they found is that if you start in '94, you have the median Democrat and the median Republican. And they pretty much agree with each other. You see, there's very little difference between them. And what you see in this purple, so the purple over here and the purple over here, that means that people who are Republicans, who are actually more liberal than the median Democrat, and you also have a lot of Democrats who are more conservative than the median Republican. And so you have a lot of overlap between the parties. 2004, you see a pretty similar thing. There's a little change, but the median very close, people on both sides. Fast forward a little, we get to 2017. So what's different in 2017? There's a big difference here. You see the medians ran away. They're very separate, and there's very, very few people now. If you're a Republican, you're very unlikely to be more liberal than the median Democrat, and vice versa. And that's a change that happened just in the past few years. So what we're seeing is that the parties don't have that much in common anymore. And the other issue is that people might say, okay, the parties weren't really representing people. You have all these people who believe all kinds of things, and what does that mean? So now Democrats represent liberals and Republicans represent conservatives. Maybe that's a good thing. Sure, that's fine. However, if you actually, there's some research looking at how the changes worked, and what people found was that it's actually not quite working that way. In fact, what they found using lagged studies, so using something called a panel data set. So a panel data set means you do a survey, but you asked the same person the same question several years in a row. So you go to Bob and you'll say, hey Bob, what party are you? And then you'll go back to Bob a year later and you'll say, what party are you? And you ask him, what do you think about these issues? And using that, you can sort of check, did they change parties to align with their issues, or were they already in the party, did they change their issues to align with the party? And what they actually found was that people are changing their policies to align with their party, rather than the other way around, which I think is very interesting. And it ties into sort of, I think a lot of people recently, politics has become almost an identity issue. And it's not just, this is what I think should be the best policy, but it's, this is an important part of myself, and I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, I'm a Republican, whatever. And I think that's noteworthy because it really changes the discourse. And I think it's one of the reasons where we have such a partisan moment. So if you think about it, if you have an election, the country's pretty evenly divided. What happens now is that people are really, really invested in the outcome. And that's great. They go, they're active, they vote, they protest. You know, everyone loves that. However, then you have the election. And one side has to win. And one side has to not win. And when that happens, one side, because their identity is tied up in winning, it's very tough for them. And I don't know that there's a solution. I'm not saying this is good or bad, but it's definitely something that has changed. And the other thing, it makes it very hard to compromise. So it's one thing to say, I'm going to compromise on this issue that no one really knows much about. We're going to trade, and we're going to come out with some bill that's halfway between. But if your identity is at stake, you can't really compromise on your identity. And that's hard because when Congress can't compromise, it really can't get very much done. And you end up with the gridlock we see where basically nothing happens. And that's not really great for the country. The other thing is that, so here we have a chart of changes on, in particular, attitudes toward discrimination, but you see that on various issues recently over the past 10 years or so. And what you've actually seen is that liberals have actually changed their views a bit more than conservatives, who are pretty similar. So if you see, conservatives are the red line here. And basically, conservatives haven't changed very much. They think the same about discrimination as they thought in 2009. But liberals, and this is white liberals in particular, have changed. So they went up quite a bit on most of these issues. And that's something to keep in mind if you think about, oh, these terrible Republicans, they're troglodytes, they're horrible, but they haven't really changed that much. And that's not to say that that's good or bad. There's nothing wrong with changing. It may be that the correct answer is up there where the blue line is. But these are people who are pretty much where they were a few years ago. It's worth keeping in mind. So not just are people divided, there's a lot of hostility, as I'm sure you're aware. People don't like the other party. So up here you see they ask people, what do you think of the other party? And both parties basically said the other party is not open-minded, they're not honest, they're not intelligent, they're lazy. I don't like these people. Now, and both parties are saying this about each other. This is not one side. And furthermore, people get angry and they get afraid. So you see 55% of Democrats are afraid of Republicans. 49% of Republicans are afraid of Democrats. So everyone is afraid of each other. And it's actually among politically active people, engaged people, it's even worse. 70% of politically engaged Democrats are afraid of Republicans, and 62% of politically engaged Republicans are afraid. Now, I just think it's worth noting that this is not great if we're all one country and we need to get along to some degree, but we hate each other and we're afraid of each other. So why does that happen? One of the reasons is that we really don't talk to each other anymore. So up here you see they ask people, do you have any friends from the other party? And most people don't have very many friends from the other party. In fact, around 50-something%, 60-something% have either none or just a few friends from the other party. But they have a lot of friends from their own party, and they don't even have very many independent friends. So what you're really seeing is people have a social circle, and they largely agree with them on most political issues. And furthermore, they asked, this was a great survey, they asked people, what do you think of the other party? Who do you think makes it up? And what they found was that people don't have a great idea of exactly what the other party is like. So up here, most Republicans think Democrats are all atheists, they're all black, They're all gay, and they're all union members. Now, as you can see here, that's not actually what they are. This is the actual number. This is the estimate. There's a difference of 20, 30 points on all of these things. So all those Republicans out there, that's what they think of Democrats. And Democrats at the same time, so what I think is fascinating, they asked, are Republicans rich? So 44% of Democrats say most Republicans make more than $250,000 a year. In reality, it's 2%. So that's a pretty big difference. Believe it or not, there are a lot of Republicans who are not rich. And also, they think they're old, they're evangelical, they're Southerners. There are a lot of Republicans who are those things, but not quite as much as people say. You see differences 23, 10, 8. So people have a social circle that's only their party. They don't talk to the other party, and they have no idea what the other party is like. But they're afraid of the other party, and they don't like the other party. So that's not great. So I'm actually going to hold on that for a bit. So the other thing is someone might say, OK, well, that's fine. People don't like each other, but my party's right. My party is the party of science. Your party is not the party of science. You believe in this crazy stuff. You're racist. You're terrible. And you're creating a false equivalence. And you can make that argument. But because I figured people might make that argument, I decided to offer some data. So here is a survey that Pew did. And they surveyed scientists, and then they surveyed the public. And so what they found was they asked them a couple issues. So the first, they asked climate change. Do you think climate change is a real thing? And pretty much all scientists said, yes, we do. I'm sure that's not a surprise to most of you. However, they then asked the public 50%. And that's mostly Republicans don't really believe in climate change. So that's a clear issue where Republicans are not agreeing with the scientific consensus. However, there's two other issues up here that I put, as you'll notice. And one of them is GMOs, so genetically modified food. So they asked these same scientists, is genetically modified food safe? And 88% of them, even more than for global warming or climate change, said they are safe. Yet if you look at the public, only 37% of the public agrees with that. And that's a difference of 51%. And also nuclear power plants, so around 2/3 of scientists said we should build more nuclear power plants. Only 45% of the public agrees with that. And this is an issue. The reason I highlight these two issues is they're issues where it's actually people on the left who tend to disagree more with the scientific consensus. And so this is not to say that the parties are equal or that you should think that they're totally the same, but just to point out that depending on what issue you look at, people aren't necessarily pro-science or anti-science. People have their issues, and they're very reluctant to change their beliefs based on data or science or anything. And if the science confirms their belief, that's great. And if the science doesn't confirm their belief, whichever party they are, they're going to be resistant to agree with that. And so just keep that in mind. OK, so what do we mean by bias? So you hear a lot. People talk about media bias. And that's something I spend a lot of time on the flip side, which I'll go into a bit later. But before we get there, I just want to talk a bit about when someone say the media is biased. What exactly does that mean? And so here are some examples. So one example is tone, word choice, headlines. So here we have two headlines. We have Obama to replace U.S. attorneys, and then we have Trump team ousts Obama-appointed U.S. attorneys. Now, you might not be able to see it, so it's almost cut off, but these articles are by the same person. They're both by Josh Gerstein. They're both in Political, and they're both about things that are pretty similar. So a new president gets in. What they generally do when they get in is they hire new attorneys. It's a political position. Yet, if you compare the two headlines, the headlines convey very different meaning. And they're both true. So this isn't fake news in the way that one is just false, but the way they chose to cover it maybe conveys a bit of a different meaning. And conservatives would argue that that meaning is slanted. And I think liberals would argue the same about, say, Fox News. And this is not something where one side or the other is blameless. I think both sides fall prey to this. Another issue is anecdotes. So you see here, talking about refugees. So one side focuses on refugee who goes to Princeton. Another side focuses on refugee who commits an assault. Now, both of these are outliers. Obviously, most refugees do not go to Princeton, and most don't assault people. But, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of refugees. So focusing on this anecdote, it elicits this emotion in people, but it's an emotion that's not based in reality. So Sure, there might be a few outliers, but that's true of any large group of people. But what is it that you want people to focus on? And this gets into something that I studied a lot is behavioral economics, and I'll just very, very briefly mention. So it's something called the heuristic bias. And so what happens is people think of things in frames. And so when you're thinking about something like refugees, what do you think about? What's in your head? And is what's in your head, oh, this guy went to Princeton, that's great, I love refugees. Or is what's in your head, oh, that refugee, he assaulted someone, I hate refugees. And how you think about this particular emotional example can change how you feel about the policy as a whole. And that's why they do this, but that's bias. Another example. So you have two headlines here about a poll on Kavanaugh. These are the same poll. The headlines are talking about the same set of data. Now, they're obviously very different. One says majority of Americans oppose Kavanaugh's confirmation. That's something the poll showed. It's accurate. The other one, however, says, oh, independents disapprove of how Democrats handled it. Now, that's also in the poll. It's maybe not the main point of the poll, as the other one points, but just how you offer the data, I think, is illustrative, because what's the purpose of these headlines? So this headline is clearly meant to convey a message that's sort of pro-Kavanaugh while still being accurate. And so just keep in mind, and if you actually read the article, they'll sort of explain the details, but how many people read the article? How many times do you see a headline and you think, oh, that's a headline, I don't need to read the article? Or you read the first paragraph and you skim it and you say, oh, that's great, but if you went down 8 paragraphs, you might find out, oh, maybe it's a bit more complicated than what we see here. I didn't include a slide of it, but there's another sort of slightly more recent example. We actually used it on the flip side. There was a poll that, it was before the midterms, and the headline was, Democratic women turbocharged to vote. And so you see from this headline, oh, Democratic women, they're going to vote, they're really excited, it's a big deal. But if you look at the data, they found that 71% of Democratic women said they wanted to vote. 69% of Republican women said they wanted to vote. These are pretty similar. And then you had, I think, 68% of Republican men and 64% of Democratic men were also very excited. Now, to me, that says a lot of people are excited. Women are more excited than men. There's not that much party difference. But that's not what the headline said. Also, focusing on one side of a story. So a lot of stories have two sides. You have a lot of issues where either rights are in conflict or people have some issue. And most of the time, it's not just one guy is there and he's the only side. And that's silly, because most issues have two sides, or no one would disagree about them. And here you see, focusing on one particular issue, 2 articles that focus on only one side. So you have this new HHS rule, and one of the rules is, basically it's a conflict between religious conscience and LGBTQ rights. And this is not to say that they're equivalent or that one should win or one should not, but just to point out how each side says, this is the issue, this is all you should care about. Rather than saying, hey, this is a complicated issue, there's a lot of different stuff at play, they're in conflict, how do we resolve this? They just sort of ignore the other side entirely. So that's something you see. And finally, choosing what to cover. So this is one example. This example is not limited to those on the left. For example, Fox will not cover the Mueller investigation very much, stuff along those lines, but we actually see this relatively often so on flip side, every day we pick an issue and we say we're going to cover this issue. And sometimes we'll have an issue and one side is all over and say this is the big news, it's a big deal, they write all these articles, and the other side does not. They just ignore it. And that's really frustrating for us because we want there to be both sides. We think both sides should be represented, and sometimes one side is just missing. Okay, where are we? Sorry. Getting too fast. There we go. Okay. So does this mean that the media is all fake news? You'll see Trump say, oh, the media is just fake news, you should ignore it. No. So I don't think the media is all fake news. And I think most people, on both sides really, don't really believe that. They might say it as sort of a clickbait, but I think most people realize that a lot of journalists, they're doing their best. So journalism is not perfect. I mean, I pointed out a bunch of examples of potential bias we see, but I don't think it's deliberate. So I don't think journalists wake up and say, I am going to fight Donald Trump today. Well, maybe they do, but not too many of them. But I think what you see is actually a bit different. I think what you see is a result of confirmation bias. So what happens is the country is very polarized, and people live in their bubbles and they don't talk to each other. But the media also has a bubble. And the media has, at least the mainstream media, if you will, has a predominantly liberal bubble. And that is, I think, where much of the issues come from. So here we have a survey done of the political views of financial reporters. Now, I would imagine financial reporters, if anything, are going to be a bit more conservative than the average. I mean, they're into finance and business and all that stuff. Now, that's my entirely unscientific view, but I think it's probably accurate. But what they found is that among financial journalists, there's not very many conservatives. So that's 0.46% of financial reporters identified themselves as very conservative. Meanwhile, 17% said they're very liberal. That's about 35 to 1. And similarly, just for somewhat conservative, you've got about a 10 to 1 ratio. So reporters are, by and large, pretty liberal. And here we have political donations in 2016 from news reporters. The light green here is Hillary Clinton. This is Donald Trump. It's about 96% for Clinton. That's pretty lopsided. And so the issue is that it's not that journalists are saying, okay, we hate the Republicans, we're going to fight them. But I think when you have a bubble where most of the people are on one side, and you have sort of priors that people believe on the left, they're not going to be challenged. And what that happens is you'll end up running a news story, and if it seems to fit what you think should happen, then you're probably not going to vet it quite as much. As opposed to, let's say you have a story. One example that conservatives will bring up is they'll say, you ran this story about a Republican, you wouldn't have run this about, say, Barack Obama, even if you had the same level of evidence. And the reason they say that is not because there's a deliberate bias. Oh, we want to help Obama, we won't run stuff, but because it's, you see something and you say, oh, that's crazy. They're saying Obama did this terrible thing. That can't be true. Let's check it. And maybe if you say something bad about a Republican, the media doesn't feel the need to check as much because they think, oh, that's probably going to be true. And in some cases it is true, but in some cases it's not true. And we saw it a bit in the past couple of weeks. That's not something I'm going to go into too much, but if you read the flip side in our archives, you can find plenty of examples. But I'm going to bring up a different example from social psychology. And there's actually been a movement recently by some professors in social psychology, similar, where basically it says most social psychology professors are really, really liberal, and that's hurting the field because no one is questioning things that should be questioned. And there was a paper a few years ago that came out. And the finding of the paper was that conservatives are prone to psychoticism. Those who hold conservative views also score high on this measure of psychoticism. And this was a technical term. It wasn't conservatives are going to go around killing people. But it was basically saying conservatives' beliefs are correlated with this mental thing that we've devised. And they published this paper. It was covered in the news. It went through peer review. And it was fine, except a year after the paper came out, they issued a correction. Turns out their sign was backwards. It's actually liberals who were prone to psychoticism. For what it's worth, I mean, I'm not sure it means that much, but no one noticed this. The only person who noticed it was a grad student who was going through the data and came upon it and said, hey, this seems a bit weird. Maybe this doesn't work. And checked, and it didn't work. And the authors looked at it and said, yeah, we switched the sign, and it's entirely backwards. But no one noticed this. And so it makes you wonder if they had initially started with the opposite result and said liberals are psychotic. You laugh, but might people have checked it a bit harder? Made sure to make sure it worked? Maybe they would have. And that's the type of bias I think happens most of the time. It's not that people are deliberately trying to mislead you. It's that when you have something that seems like it makes sense, you're less likely to focus on it. But at the same time, if there's something that you think must be wrong, someone comes out with this crazy idea and you're like, no, there's no way that works, you're going to check it. I mean, if you see an article and you see some news article and it says something like, you are entirely wrong, what's your response to that article? Is your response, oh, hey, I was wrong, I guess I'll change my mind? No, no one does that. Your response is, let me look at this article. Let me find the problem with this article. Let me see why it is wrong. And ideally what happens is you do that, and if you don't find anything wrong, you say, okay, maybe there's something to this. But what you are going to do is you're going to check. But if you see something that agrees with you, you don't check. And that's why you need people on both sides. And it's really important. And the news media doesn't really have that. And that's true of both the liberal and the conservative media. So what we have in the media is not just mainstream liberal media anymore. We have mainstream media and we have conservative media. And they both have their own silos. And they don't talk to each other. And in fact, you see the same biases in conservative media as conservatives complain about in liberal media. And this is a bipartisan problem. So another issue I'm going to go into is fact-checking. So you'll see people say, okay, well, conservatives lie a lot, and they're wrong, and they need to be fact-checked. And conservatives would reply, well, they have some issues with fact-checking. And so I decided I would offer a little example to show the perils of some fact checks. And so you have here two statements. Statement A is the US federal income tax rate was 0% until 1913. And then you have statement B. We did not even have a federal income tax in this country until 1913. Now, both of these statements are pretty similar. I think they're pretty similar. Maybe some of you would disagree, but they say basically the same thing, and they're basically true. So technically, you had a brief income tax during the Civil War, and then you had an attempt that was struck down by the Supreme Court. But in 1913, we amended the Constitution to say you can have income taxes, and since then, we've had income taxes. Sadly, or not sadly, depending on how much you like paying taxes. So you say, why do I highlight these two statements? Well, I'll tell you why. Because PolitiFact gave them different ratings. Statement A was rated half true. Statement B was rated mostly true. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the difference is, and you're probably not entirely sure. And I don't think anyone is entirely sure. But one reason conservatives highlight this, who said them? So statement A was made by Ron Paul in 2012, and it was half true. But then Jim Webb, a Democrat, said the same thing. That was mostly true in 2015. Now, is this a conscious thing? No, probably not. But is there a chance that a reporter who tends to agree with Democrats might think, oh, this statement by a Democrat is marginally better? Maybe. To PolitiFact's credit, it was pointed out about a year later, they changed it back to half true. So they are consistent when they're aware of it, but this was an easy case. This was a case where you had two basically identical statements. How many cases are not easy cases where you don't have identical statements, and where do they come down? And the other issue is context. So one thing that happens when you do a fact check is they'll often add context. So you see this isn't true, false, it's half true, mostly true, partially true. Those are judgment calls in a way. And obviously I think there's something to be said for saying, okay, this statement is technically true, but it's misleading, and here's why. And that's fine. But at some point, the question is, when you add context, how much does that allow bias to creep in? Because it's not just an objective, is it right, is it not right? It's not quite that simple, and when you do that, problems can come up. There's actually an analysis that found that on average, Republican fact checks were longer. They had a higher word count than Democratic fact checks. And does that mean that Republicans need more explanation? Maybe. Or maybe it means they're trying a bit harder to explain context. And the other problem is, so statement B, they changed it. They didn't change the analysis at all. So they left the same explanation, but switched it to half true, which says to me the difference between half true and mostly true, there isn't much. Except if you read the two, they seem kind of different, mostly true, half true. But in practice, what's the line? The other issue is context, or choice of what to fact check. So here you have fact checks on Mitt Romney and fact checks on all Democrats. So Pants on Fire is the worst rating you can get. It means this is totally, entirely false. Mitt Romney got 19 of these from PolitiFact during the 2012 campaign. Now, every Democrat combined got 25 of them for 10 years from 2007 to 2016. Now, maybe you think Mitt Romney was just this pathological liar who ran around spouting nonsense all day during the 2012 campaign. I guess that's possible. But the other possibility is maybe they chose to fact check particular things about Romney and maybe not about other people. And maybe that there was some bias in there. And to illustrate that example, we have a recent fact check. Though it's not really a fact check, this is probably too small to read, but this was during the State of the Union. Trump explained that we now have a historic number of women in Congress, and this was good. I think everyone agrees this is a good thing. Everyone applauded. NPR decided to do a fact check on that. Now, they didn't say this is false, but they said, hey, this is true, but most of these women are Democrats. This is true. I don't think anyone would dispute that, and I don't think even Trump disputed that. He didn't say, we have a historic number of Democrats because of me. It was all me. Now, I could see him saying something like that. That's the type of thing he says, but he didn't say that. But NPR did a fact check where they said, well, we're going to assume he said something like that and check it. And when you do that and when you call it a fact check, people wonder, is this really a fact check, or is this just us saying we don't really like the guy, so we're going to add context that makes him look bad? And it's fine to do that for an op-ed, but don't call it a fact check. And just in line with that, so this was during the primary campaign. PolitiFact fact checked Scott Walker's claim that he paid $1 for a sweater. Now, I'm sure all of you really wanted to get to the bottom of this. It's a very important issue. Yeah, it was true. He spent $1, but it makes you wonder, how do they choose what they cover? Why would they put something like that? It's a bit silly. And would they have covered Obama paying $1 for a sweater? Maybe. So another factor that's not great, it's a survey of people. They said, how do you feel about the media? And they asked people, do you think the media is very accurate? And most people said no. And this is probably not a big surprise. Only around, this is down here, around 87 or 18% of people said the media is very accurate. But what I think is even worse, they asked people, what about the media you use the most? And people said about the media they use, only about 36% said it was very accurate. That means that 2/3 of people do not say the media they use is very accurate, which is not a good time for the media right now. And whether that's true or not, there's a definite trust issue. Okay, so where do we go from here? So I just told you the country is polarized, everyone hates each other, the media is biased, everyone hates the media, everything's a mess. What are we going to do? So I have some answers. Well, I have some potential answers. Whether they'll work, I don't know, but we can try. I think we should at least try. So engage productively. So what does that mean? When you talk to someone, what's your goal? Are you trying to fight them? Are you trying to own the libs or own the cons? That's something that comes up. Or are you trying to be constructive? And so one way to do that is focus on the process. So we're a country that's a two-party system, more or less evenly divided. And what that means in practice is that both parties win every so often. They more or less alternate. So you have 2 terms of a Republican, then 2 terms of a Democrat, then 2 terms of a Republican, and vice versa. And that holds pretty true. But what that means in practice is that whoever is in power now, a few years from now, you won't be in power. And whoever is not in power now, a few years from now, you will be in power. And if you think of it that way, whenever you're arguing for some sort of process issue, let's say you like executive orders or don't like executive orders, keep in mind that a few years from now, you'll be on the other side. And think about, when you're on the other side, would you want the people you're fighting right now to do the same thing you're doing? And if your answer is no, then maybe you should think about it and say, you know what? This is not something I would want to happen to me. Do I really want to do it to them? Because if I do, they're going to turn around and do the same thing. And just to offer an example of this, you had in 2015, I think, Obama issued an executive order called DAPA. Right now you see DACA is in the news. That's deferred for children. But he actually issued another executive order for their parents and for their relatives. It was called DAPA. And a court in Texas decided to block it. The court said, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. It eventually went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was evenly divided. And that means this was after Scalia had died, and so they were tied 4-4, and they couldn't make a decision, so the lower court decision stood. And it was actually the appeals court decision. But what happened was then, fast forward, Donald Trump wins. He issues a travel ban. People sue him. And what happens is state attorneys general who were suing him, who had actually taken the opposite position under Obama, started citing the Texas decision that they had disagreed with as precedent. And that's fine. I mean, that's their job. You want to win. But it's also not consistent. Either you believe executive orders are constitutional or they're not. But if there's no sustainable system where your side gets executive orders and the other side doesn't. That's not going to work, because the other side is going to get in and they're going to say, you did this, I'm going to do this too. So just keep in mind when you're talking about that. And the other reason to focus on process is because it's less emotionally charged. So if you have an issue, people feel very, very strongly about this issue, and they say, I really care about this. And you start arguing with them, they're going to get upset, they're going to get angry. That's not helpful. But if you say, let's take a step back. Let's not talk about this specific issue. Let's talk about how we approach the issue. So if you say, the travel ban is terrible, it's horrible, it's harmful, we shouldn't do it, that's fine, that's an opinion you can have, but don't talk about that. Don't argue on that way. Say, let's talk about how it happened. Let's talk about the fact that it was an executive order. How do we want that to happen? Is that the right way to do it? Regardless of the policy itself, I think that's one way to get to talk to people where you aren't fighting as much. Number 2, don't assume bad faith. So you see a lot of times people sort of assume the other side is terrible. I mean, we went through it. The other side is wrong, and they're closed-minded, and they're stupid. Now, that's a bad assumption to make, because if you assume bad faith, one, it's very easy to find. So you'll take comments that are maybe ambiguous, and you'll say, okay, here, let's assign the worst possible meaning to this comment, and let's have us prove that the other person is bad. And you can do that all day, and you can find a lot of bad people out there. But I think in practice, most people are not operating in bad faith. Most people don't wake up and say, I hate America, I want to ruin America, let's destroy it. No, very few people do that. In fact, most people say we love America, but we might disagree what America should be and how to make it that way. But it's a good faith disagreement. So instead of saying, hey, you want to destroy America, maybe say, why do you want to do that terrible thing? What makes you think that that will help America? And maybe try to understand a little of where they're coming from. You may not agree with them, but at least you'll understand. And maybe you can find some sort of common ground where maybe you say, okay, I don't agree with you on everything, but here's one issue where we don't entirely disagree. Maybe we can work on that. And vice versa. Maybe you can explain to them, this is why I believe these crazy things that you think are insane. I actually think they're good, and here's why. And there's very little of that happening right now. Number 3, federalism. So, as I'm sure you all learned in Civics 101, we have a federal system. You have states. They have their own policies and their own laws, and the federal government, which was initially not quite so large, is now a bit larger. But the states definitely have a lot to say about different policies, and I think that's important because our country is very different. So you have people in Illinois, in Chicago, and in New York, and in California, and they're very liberal, and they really support liberal policies. And then you have people in Texas, and in Mississippi, and in Alabama, and they support very different policies. But we're all one country. And what did the founders say? They said, you know what? We have very different people in this country. Let's have a federal system. Let's have Texas do their thing, and let's have New York and Illinois, or Chicago, but Illinois, do its thing. And that's fine. And that way people can coexist even though they disagree. And I think it's very dangerous when you adopt a sort of zero-sum approach where the whole country has to be uniform on whatever contentious issue is, because, as I pointed out before, people are very invested in this stuff, and one side is going to lose. So if you tell half the country we're going to impose our beliefs on you, they're going to be very upset. As you would be upset if the other half of the country said, you know what, we're going to impose our beliefs on you. But you don't have to. There's a solution that works for both. No one's going to be super happy. Sure, You accept that Texas will do things you don't like, and Texas will accept you do things that Texas doesn't like. But I think that's better than half of the country being really, really upset when you don't have to do that. And that's problematic. Let's see. Okay, so the flip side. So I come to you as a representative of the flip side, which is I'm the co-editor of. And so basically what the flip side does is it's my own effort to make a little difference in sort of partisanship currently afflicting us. And the idea is that every morning we pick an issue and we send you an email newsletter, and it lists perspectives on the issue from both sides. So we say, here's what liberals think about this issue, here's what conservatives think about the issue. And the idea is people live in our little bubbles, and we talk to people who agree with us, and we read newspapers that agree with us, and we aren't really exposed to other views. But let's say we say, okay, you know what, that's a problem. I want to know what the other side thinks. Well, where do you start? Chances are you have no idea where to start. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there on the right, and there's crazy stuff out there on the left. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to have no idea where to start. So you might go and read some crazy conspiracy theory on InfoWars. If you know what InfoWars is, it's a conspiracy website who happens to like Trump and thinks Hillary Clinton is an alien sent from outer space to, I guess, kill people in pizza parlors, or I don't know. But if you're just looking for conservatives and you somehow happen among InfoWars and you think, oh, this is what conservatives are like, chances are that's not good, because that's not what conservatives are like, and you shouldn't think that. So what we do is we take good articles from both sides, and we say, here's what reasonable people, or sane people, if you will, on both sides are saying, and here's why they're saying it. And so it just gives you an idea, what are these people saying? And furthermore, what are those people who live a couple miles away downstate in their little bubble, very, very far from here, I know. What are they reading? So what news are they getting? How are they understanding the world? And that gives you a starting point to at least be able to engage with them. So instead of saying, oh, that's totally wrong, how could you ever think something terrible, you can actually read, this is what they think, this is why they think it. And it gives you a way to speak to them. And even if you don't agree, and you don't have to agree, I mean, I don't expect everyone to wake up tomorrow and say, okay, I was totally wrong, I'm going to join the other side. In fact, you shouldn't do that. There's nothing wrong with your side. You should just be aware that there are other sides. And it's okay to agree to disagree about some issues. So this is a sample of what we do. We have a left side and a right side. We have this is sort of cutting off the top, but we have a summary at the top explaining what's going on. And then we have a bunch of articles, usually around 5 or 6 articles for each side. And what we do is we pull out a quote from each article that sort of summarizes what's being said. And if you want to read the whole article, you're welcome. We link to the article. But you can also just read our little snippet and get the basic idea. And it's meant to be read in about 5 minutes. So this is not a huge time commitment. It's you wake up every day, you check your email, you spend a few minutes reading, and you hopefully learn something. And the way we do it, so a lot of people will get our newsletter and they'll read their side and they'll say, this is great, I agree with this. And then they'll email us and say, this is great, or they'll email us and say, you know what, I don't like that article, it's my side and I think you're wrong, you shouldn't quote that article. We get that a lot too. In particular, conservatives get very angry when we quote the New York Times. And we get angry emails, even though we explain to them that there are, in fact, conservatives who write in the New York Times sometimes. Believe it or not, there are liberals who write on Fox News. It happens. We don't quote them that much, but it exists, and I'm sure if we quoted them, we would get angry emails. How dare you put Fox on the left? They're conservative, but we put people based on what they are, not where they're writing. But I think that's, in a way, reading your own side is great. That's fine. We like when you read our newsletter, but you really should be reading the other side, because that's how you learn. When we write our newsletter, we don't write it so it caters to people who agree with us. So we have, it's me and my co-editor. She's a former Clinton staffer, and she does the liberal side. I do the conservative side. And when I'm doing the conservative side, I don't say, here's how I can really, really show those liberals who's right, and I'm going to show them they're wrong, and no, that's not the point. What I say is, how can I offer an opinion that's reasonable that people will understand? how can I offer something? They don't have to agree, but so they'll understand, here's where these people are coming from. And what we'll often do is we'll deliberately choose not to use anything that's inflammatory. So if you go and read the media, you can find all kinds of stuff on both sides saying these people are terrible, I hate them, they're evil people, and we don't cite that stuff. And that's true even when we might agree with it. So sometimes you think, okay, this is horrible, these people are terrible, how dare they do this? But that's not productive. What's productive is to say, here's why these people think this. Whether it's good or bad, if we get an angry reaction from our audience, that's not helpful because that's not opening up their mind. And so that's how we approach it. So in addition to the flip side, you should all subscribe, by the way. I brought a bunch of cards, and at the end I'll give you the URL. You can subscribe to it. It's theflipside.io, but some other media sources that I like, that the flip side likes, because I think they offer interesting perspectives. So 538, it's Nate Silver. He's a statistician, and he does a lot of statistical analysis of politics, and I think it's very interesting. A lot of the stuff I got earlier about how people change their views to fit their party came from 538, and from articles that they cited. And so I think it's worth reading. Also, if you like sports, he does sports analysis too. If not, there's a politics tab. You can avoid the sports. Quillette, it's a relatively new magazine. It's hard to place. It's people on the left, but sort of traditional liberal, I think. And they have some interesting articles. They often have academics do guest posts, or I guess not guest posts, just authors. The Atlantic, I'm sure you're aware of. It's a magazine that has been around for a while, and they tend to try to have different perspectives. And City Journal is based in New York. It's a magazine. It's more on the conservative side, but I think they have good articles. It's more long-form articles, so it's not, here's the breaking news. So we actually don't cite them very much because they don't do breaking news, but they have a lot of very interesting articles that come out. Talk to your friends and neighbors. So believe it or not, there are probably people, even in Chicago, who don't agree with you on everything. Some of you may have family members, or maybe you have friends from different areas. Maybe you went to college with people. The best way to understand people is to talk to them. And as we saw, most people don't have friends outside of their social circle. And you know what? That's a problem. And that's a problem because you don't understand these people. And if you just try interacting with people, you might find that most people are really not evil. They might disagree with you, and you might feel very strongly this person is wrong. And you might try to convince them and say, you know what, here's why I think you're wrong, and that's fine. But what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't say, I don't even want to talk to these people, because what you think about them might actually be wrong. And as we know, what people think about the parties really is wrong. So ask yourself that question. Final point I want to make is that another reason it's really important to sort of know about the other side is something that I've discovered. So we can get into it in the Q&A if you're interested. But just in sort of day-to-day operation. So obviously, we're working on this stuff, and there's some very strong feelings sometimes. And we have both sides. And we have a whole team that we use. But at the end of the day, it's me and my co-editor. And a lot of people ask us, how do you deal with it when you have arguments? How do you deal with it when you get angry at each other? When you say, this is terrible, how can you believe this terrible thing? And what I think happens most, and the biggest problem, is unexpected things. So it's one thing if you say, okay, I know you believe this thing, and I think it's wrong, but I know about it. But what has caused the biggest problems, at least in my experience, is you'll have some issue, and my co-editor will say, oh, look at these crazy people. They're doing all this crazy stuff. How could they say such crazy things? And I'll be like, you know, I agree with them. And vice versa. And that's, I think, a bigger issue because it's more of the shock. So if you think back to the election in 2016, I think a lot of people were pretty upset after the results came out. And I think one of the main reasons was that it was unexpected. If you looked at the forecasters, you had anywhere from 70 to 99.9% Clinton winning. In fact, there's an article, I think in Huffington Post, saying Nate Silver is a terrible person because he said Trump had a 30% chance. And he should acknowledge that it's not 30%, it's 0. So people are reading these articles, and they think, okay, we're going to win, and then suddenly they don't win. And I think that's even worse than saying, oh, it's a close election, it's a toss-up, who knows who's going to win. at least you're prepared. And the biggest problem is when you're not prepared. And the best way to be prepared is to understand what people think, to read what they're reading, and then you won't be caught off guard as much. I'll leave you with a cartoon, which I like very much. I'm sure this applies to none of you, but just a reminder, believe it or not, there are more important things than politics, so don't kill yourself. And go to bed. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. I was just wondering how you come up against a sort of a primal instinct that people have to take sides and want to win. And winning can be very important. I just heard a recent lecture where they were citing an early psychological study where people estimated the number of dots, and they were divided into overestimators and underestimators. And people would side with those that were, it was a meaningless situation. They would side who's ever on their side, and they even bribed the people. We'll give you $1 if you'll switch sides, and they wouldn't do it. And it seems to me that this is being exploited very much in the current political review, where the current president, you're a winner or you're a loser. So how do you meet that challenge?
So that's a good question. And it's a hard question. You bring up that example. There's another great example. They did a study where they asked people, basically they said, does partisanship stop you from doing math? And the answer is yes. So what they did was they gave people a bar graph, and they basically said, here's a bar graph. It shows, does this skin cream work? And they said, can you tell us, does the skin cream work? And most people could. It was a basic bar graph, one skin cream percent effective, and they compared it to another skin cream. But then they took the same bar graph and they changed the labels. And instead of the bar graph being about skin cream, it was about gun control or about some political issue. And what they found was that when they gave people the same bar graph, and they weren't asking, do you agree with this? They were just saying, what does the bar graph show? People got the math wrong. And in particular, people who were more politically engaged were more likely to get it wrong. And is this a conscious thing? Are people saying, I don't like this? Or are they just really, people just have such a problem accepting evidence that they don't agree with? And that's a hard question. So I think the idea is you have to try to talk to each other. So why is winning a political thing? Does it have to be my party versus your party? Maybe you could work together so both people win, not at the expense of someone. And yeah, so we're very divided. That's why I do what I do, and hopefully why people like to listen to me, because maybe I can help a little. And that's not a great answer, I know, but I think you have to make an effort to at least engage with the other side, because right now you have Team A and Team B, and it's very easy to fight Team B because you're on Team A and you don't know Team B and you haven't talked to them and you don't know anything about them. If you had friends on Team B, maybe you would be a bit less antagonistic. Maybe you wouldn't be quite so eager to beat Team B if beating Team B meant you were beating your friends or your family members. So I think the real solution to a lot of this is just exposure. So learn about people who disagree with you and engage with them. And maybe that will help somewhat, and you'll still have elections and they'll still be competitive and there are still issues that need to be decided, but maybe you can take a bit of the rancor out and you can have people accepting, this is how I feel, but the other side doesn't have horns, they're not terrible, they're just wrong.
Hi. Do you think universities play a significant role in this polarization?
That's a good question. So if you ask a conservative, universities are terrible places where people are indoctrinated in terrible liberal ideas. I think that's maybe a bit simplistic, but there is an interesting, it's called Heterodox Academy. I mentioned it earlier, it's a bunch of social psychology professors who are sort of trying to deal with polarization in their field at least, and they do a lot of work on also political campuses. And what they found is that professors are very, very liberal, and administrators are actually very liberal, but students are not quite so liberal. And the real question is, I think, not are colleges the problem, because we need colleges, obviously, you need to teach people, but how are colleges preparing students for the world? And one thing that we've seen recently that I think is quite problematic is lack of free speech, if you will. So you'll see a speaker will come to campus, and people will say, I don't want him to speak, and I'm going to stop him from speaking. It's not, I disagree with him, I think he's wrong, it's he should be silenced. And I think that's a very dangerous attitude to have, because if you teach college students attitudes that are bad or wrong should never be shown. You should just, if you believe them, you should either shut up or just leave and be gone forever. You're not going to be exposed to those. And if you're not exposed to those, you're not going to learn. And to the extent that that goes beyond college campuses, that's problematic. And to the extent that people who are learning to be adults in college are not being exposed to different views, I think that's also very bad. So I think I'm from the University of Chicago, which is actually very good on free speech, and so I'm very proud of them. Not all places are quite so good. But I think it's very important for colleges to offer people different ideas, just so they can learn. And I think a lot of them are failing to do that, and that's problematic. But I also think there's a lot of pushback recently that's making headway. There's an organization called FIRE. It's the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and they work for free speech on campus. And they're actually encouraging campuses to change their policies to allow free speech. And I think that's important. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Right over here.
Thanks for your talk, very interesting. On the flip side, do you avoid topics that have a clear-cut answer, or are you, and therefore just picking stuff that you could argue both sides? Like, how would you cover, is climate change a hoax? Would you present the flip side to that?
So that's an interesting question, and I'll answer it in two parts. And so on one hand, what happens when people don't disagree? So there are some issues where everyone is basically saying, this is what we think, and people, conservatives and liberals, are both agreeing. For example, recently, everyone agrees that faking hate crimes is really bad. And there's no one who says this is a good thing. Yet we covered it, and what we do is when there is agreement, we will actually highlight that. And we'll, up top where we have the background, we will say, here's a point of agreement between the two sides. So that's one thing we do. And the other point is, so you bring up climate change. What do you do when one side is right? So that's an interesting question. And what we do is, our policy is that we will not cite anything if it is factually wrong or if it's misleading. And by misleading, when you read this, will you believe something that's not true? And so what happens is, that's actually more common than you think. And I don't think it's necessarily intentional, but I have the curse of knowing a lot of details about policy, and a lot of journalists do not know as many details, and so they don't always quite understand what they're writing about. And sometimes I'll point that out, and so we won't run something. That's not really answering your question, but there isn't so much. So if you have an issue that's only being covered by one side, we usually don't cover it. Or if there's only sort of sane stuff from one side, we try not to cover it, just because it's not very interesting. So we don't like to say, here's one side. Because if you say, here's one side, people on the other side are not going to say, oh, you told us there's only one side. That means we have to change. No, they're going to say, what's wrong with you? Where's my side? And it's not going to help. So we don't usually do that. But what we will do is, if there's mostly stuff on one side and a little stuff, we will still cover it. If it's something we think is newsworthy, and we'll say, here's what this side is saying, and we'll try to find some way of sort of getting across the other side in a way that's not misleading. Because I think most issues, even if the facts are very clear, there's a difference between sort of facts and policy. And you might agree on all of the facts, but still disagree on the policy. And to use your climate change example, you can agree that climate change is caused by humans, but disagree on what we should do about it. And that's something that we could still highlight. So you could say, you know what, whatever you think about what's happening, what should we do is something that reasonable people can have a discussion about. So we would cover that.
Questions from the left?
Great talk. What is, I guess, your quote-unquote business model? I mean, are you all volunteers? Is this your day job? Like, how do you make it work?
So right now, we're all volunteers. It's been almost 2 years now. And we are actually looking at different funding sources because we can't really continue being volunteers forever. It's a lot of work. We have a team of interns, really. So if you know any college-age kids who are looking for an internship, send them my way. But you will actually, if you subscribe, you may hear something pretty soon, actually, about funding. But that's something we're working on. It's hard in journalism.
So I know the Snopes website has gotten a lot of work out in the last couple of years, and I use it a lot in terms of fact-checking. Can you recommend any nonpartisan fact-checking sites that you may use or recommend?
So I didn't mean to say that you shouldn't use fact-checking websites. So I think most of the sites that there are generally pretty good. There's, I think, a fact-checking accrediting organization. I forget, it has some acronym. And so if you stick to people recommended by that, I think you're probably safe. So from the right, for example, a Weekly Standard had a fact checker. I think it's probably gone now because they're gone. But I would just say, just keep in mind when you're looking at the fact check, where is this coming from? Is there a potential for bias? Are they adding context? Just read the article, basically. Don't just go off the headline. And I think you'll be safe. And that's true in general. If you're looking at an article, read the whole article. Don't read the headline. And if you're on Facebook, don't share an article if you haven't read it. read the post first. So yeah, stick to, I mean, Snopes is fine. Snopes got made fun of because they fact check The Onion sometimes. I've done it a few times, and most recently they fact check a Babylon Bee. Babylon Bee is a conservative onion. I think it's pretty funny. But they fact check, I think, the claim that I think Hillary Clinton put her emails in a dishwasher or something, or did something silly, and they fact checked it. It's not true. But yeah, Snopes is fine, PolitiFact is fine, Washington Post does a fact check. They're generally fine.
Yeah. I was listening to Bernie Sanders the other day, and he brought out something that a lot of people don't know about. For instance, there's 3 people that own half the wealth of the United States: Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett. But the news never covers it. And this is an objective fact. How would you explain the news never covering it? Or very rarely.
Well, I could say it's biased. But, I mean, the news, obviously, they have to decide what they're going to cover. And one of the things that we've seen recently is that the news is really not a monolith. So the media is actually, it's grown quite a bit, and whether that's good or bad, it's different. So the New York Times might not cover it, but there are plenty of people farther on the left who probably are covering it. And ditto for conservative stuff. Conservatives say, oh, New York Times isn't covering whatever, but there are plenty of conservative sites who are covering it. And so I guess what I would recommend is if you feel like the media you're reading is not covering all the issues, maybe try to find sort of additional media beyond what you're reading that cover a broader array of things. We don't actually have a list. If you ask, I'll give you my card after. We actually have a list of different sources we use. I can send that to you if you're interested. And that has more stuff on the left and more stuff on the right. And some of those might have more things.
Hi. I'm wondering what you think about the litigious backlash in the recent case of Nick Sandman's parent suing the Washington Post for $250 million, and the fact that $50 million of that is supposed to be for damage to his character, and the other $200 million is supposed to be to teach the Washington Post a lesson. And what does that mean for the future of journalism?
So, well, I think they're going to lose, so I don't think it means very much for the future of journalism, personally. I guess I could be wrong. But I think, I mean, I'm more conservative, so I tend to think that huge lawsuits are bad in general, this included. I think in particular there's this idea that people will use lawsuits to sort of silence free speech, and I think that's problematic. I don't think you should use lawsuits to shut people up. I tend to think this is something as a society we do, though. So if you look on the other side, you see Michael Avenatti is suing Trump for tens of millions of dollars for, I don't even know what for, various stuff. I mean, basically every time anyone opens their mouth, someone wants to sue them, and I don't think that's good. And I think it's bad when conservatives do it. I think it's bad when liberals do it. I mean, I'm not an expert on libel law, but I think generally coverage that's a bit wrong is probably not something you can sue people for, and I don't think you should sue people for, if that answers your question.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, because you're talking about how divided the nation was very early on, and part of that is that there are a good amount of groups who feel very much that their existence is being attacked. I mean, for me personally, I've been keeping a lot with like transgendered rights issues right now, and that's very, like, for them it's very sensitive, and that's kind of why it feels very divisive and loud for them. So for instances where there is an issue of almost like civil rights, how do you guys help curate your list in a way to kind of make sure that you're getting both sides, but it's still respectful to the human rights issues that sometimes do come up in these political discussions?
Yeah, so as I think I noted before, we aren't trying to be inflammatory. So we are trying to offer stuff that's appealing, but at the same time, we also don't really want to water down the views. And it's hard because in a lot of cases, you really do have big disagreements over really basic questions. And I think that the goal is we just want to at least educate people, if you will, so make them aware. So if you have an issue like transgender rights, so we will highlight on the left sort of here is why liberals really, really care about this issue. This is what they think about it. Just sort of explain to conservatives, this is why they're very sensitive to this thing. And then on the right, we'll put sort of this is why conservatives maybe don't necessarily agree with all of this, and this is what their arguments are. And I think in many cases, as I noted before, there's often multiple sides. So everyone wants their issue to be a human rights issue. And this is not to say that transgender rights issues don't matter, but if you ask a sort of evangelical conservative, they're going to say my human rights are also under threat. And if you actually, I mean, I think that part of the graphic before was people are afraid. And I think a lot of people believe on both sides that they're threatened. And I think if that becomes clear, then maybe people can realize, hey, maybe there's some way to meet in the middle. There's some way of understanding where we feel, because there really are some conflicts, but you can work together to sort of deal with that conflict, and you can actually understand where people are. I don't think it's productive to call people names or on both sides. And there are really hard questions. I mean, one issue was the Supreme Court. You have the cake case, and you have this guy, and he feels very strongly, and then you have another gay couple, and they feel strongly. And there's really no answer where everyone wins. But if you acknowledge this is a hard question, I think that's the step at least to understanding.
We have time for one last question.
Ooh, and I get it. I'm curious to know the reactions you've received from the media itself, from reporters or from journalists. You know, how do they feel about being included in the flip side? What do they think about the flip side in general?
So we've actually had very positive reception from basically everyone we've talked to, for the most part. Actually, it's interesting, the most negative we've gotten is actually people on the left have gotten very angry at my co-founder. they think it's wrong to give a platform to conservatives because they're evil and I don't know, whatever. But we've actually had very, very positive reception from people, for the most part, on really both sides. And I think most journalists sort of realize maybe we're in a bubble but don't really know how to get out. And I think they see us as sort of, here's maybe a way of bridging the divide, because I think the fact that people don't trust the media is something the media doesn't like, for good reason, but doesn't really know how to fix. And so they see us as maybe this is something that will help. We've actually had a couple media sort of personalities retweet us and promote us in some ways. Ben Shapiro actually promoted us on his Twitter. He has some kind of many million followers. I'm not a huge Ben Shapiro fan, but if he likes us, then that's great. I'll take his people. Did that answer your question? Okay.
All right, thank you, Jihan.
Thank you.